In this tutorial we're going to cover how to make the character jump. In the last tutorial we covered how to make him walk left and right. So this time we're going to have him jump into the air. So whether he's jumping off a platform, landing on another one, walking left or right, falling off from one to the next and jumping back up. So we're going to cover all of that. So he has a jump animation, he goes into the fall mode when he falls off a platform. So that's what this one's going to be about. Alright, so let's get started on all that. Let's close out this Unity and open up where we last left off with. Alright, so here we have the walking and idle animation. So if I press play where we last left it, he'll walk left and right. There's no jump button, but he's able to move left and right, and if he falls off, he can't get back up there. So the first thing we want to start doing is we want to start importing our sprites. So I already have a window open. So these are the two sprites that I want to add to the scene. So I'm going to click on the project folder. I could either import a main going up to assets, import new asset, but it's probably just easier if I drag these into the sprites folder. So that imports them into the sprites folder. I can probably pull this up a little higher to see what I'm looking at. So I have a jumping sprite and a floating sprite. So he's in the air floating and he's jumping. I shouldn't need to change any of the settings right here. They should be fine. So we need to incorporate these as animations now. So I'm going to jump over to the animation tab and pull up the character. And again, we can't create an animation unless we have a character in the scene selected. So this is the character, and so this character has all of our different sprites or different animation cycles. Right now just being idle and walking. So I'm going to create a new clip, and that was clicking on an existing one and just click create new clip. I'm going to call this one, I'm going to put it in the animation folder and call this, I guess, floating, because he's floating in the air. Whether he's moving up or down, he's in the air, so I'll call it floating. And then I'll make one more after I make the floating. So we'll take the floating animation, I'll drop it in here, and it pops in right here. I only need one frame because I only have one sprite image, but it had to draw more, which would have the hair flowing in the air and the clothes ruffling as the wind's blowing against it. Then it'd have a repetitive cycle right here. But since I only have one frame for this demo, I'm just going to use one frame. And then I'm going to make one more. I'm going to create a new clip, and I'm going to call this one jumping. So I press save on that, and for the jumping, I'll grab the character jumping. So this one, again, only has one frame. Had I had more time to animate it, you'd have him like more fluidly bending down, jumping up. But at least we have him in the keyframe position of bending down. But we also want to have this more than one frame. One frame is about 1/30th of a second, so that's not going to show on the screen for very long. So I'm going to make it a little bit longer. In this case, maybe 4 frames or so. So I can right-click on the line here for frame number 4. And go to add key, and that makes it 4 frames long. And you can adjust this to whatever length you want, but it's going to repeat the first keyframe. So when I press play, actually not play on the scene, but play here, it'll play through 4 frames. So it's a really quick duck, and that's all it needs to create the realism of jumping. Alright, so now that we've had our 2 animations from the sprite folder dropped into the character, so now he has multiple different animations attached to the in the scene character right here. This should automatically update right here. So inside the animator controller, which is right here, the animator on the character, this controls all the different animations. It now has the floating and jumping automatically added in there. There's no connections to use it yet, but it's at least attached to the character. Also, while we're here, let's add a couple parameters. So I'm going to add a boolean, which is basically a true or false statement, so it can be one or the other. So there's no changing numbers, it's either one or the other. And I'm going to call this grounded. And what grounded is, he's either grounded on the ground, true, or he's not grounded on the ground, false. So either way, it's a true or false statement. And I'm going to put one more thing. I'm going to put a trigger. And the trigger I'm going to call the jump button. And what this is saying is that it's a trigger that causes one of these things to start occurring. So we have a boolean, is it true or false, for your transitions, and this is a triggered transition, which means as soon as this becomes true, this will, I mean not true, but it becomes active. And this is your floating parameters. All right, so we've added these parameters in here, and the last thing we want to add some name tags to the ground. So I'm going to click on the ground right here, and we want to change the untagged right here to ground, but there is no ground, so we're going to make a tag, and so the tag will signify what this sprite is. So I'm going to add a tag, and I'm going to type in ground for the name of it. So this this 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, whatever number you put in here, is just giving you multiple different tags that you've created. I only need 2, which is blank for a new one. I could just put 1 here, and so I'd have just the 1 tag, but it's going to automatically default to 2 because it needs to have a blank tag. All right, so we have ground, so I'm done with that. If I go back to, let's say, grabbing the sprite, I now have the option, because I made a tag, to click ground, and you can keep adding multiple tags. This just allows you to classify what the object is and call it up in code. So we have ground right here, so this is now a ground sprite. I can do the same thing here. The ground sprite won't, or the tag won't apply to an empty object right here, because this is a holder of this sprite. And so I have to tag all of these manually, the sprite itself, not the empty. For some reason, when I first dropped them in there, they weren't allowing me to select them. I had to use the empty to do this. I think if you go to add a sprite, and so now we've added a sprite, it's a blank sprite, and then for the sprite render, I assign what the sprite is, and let's say the ground sprite. So now this sprite is clickable because I went through create sprite rather than just dragging a sprite into the scene. Oops, sprites. But now that I've dragged one into the scene, they all become selectable now. So now I can start dragging them in there. So if I drag another one in there, it automatically has the box that I can start moving it around. So for some reason, the first time we drag it in there, it's just better to go to hierarchy, create, sprite, and then from then on you can start dragging and dropping. So I'm going to leave this one up here so we can jump up higher later, and I'll put this one up here so we can jump up higher. So we can start building a area. But again, all of these need to be tagged as a ground, otherwise it won't know that he's colliding with the ground. It'll have collision, but the code won't know what to do with that collision. So again, let's go to ground, and I'll give you an example of one that's not tagged when the character gets that far. So I'll leave that like that. I'll move it a little lower. Alright, so we have all of that, and the next thing we want to go through is start coding the character. So I'm going to click on the character, so it's selected here, and I don't really need these groups anymore. I could pull the ground out and then just go and delete the group if I want. This looks like the empty, so I can delete this one. So I could do that if I want, and so I'm just clicking on the sprites now. So either way, we grab the sprite character. I'll move that lower, keep him at the top. So we're going to pull up the editor, and the last we left off with, we have the movement control, which I'm not going to recover all that, but it basically moves him left and right and controls the flipping. So we want to add a jump state now, and we can add a jump state here, but we want to be able to use multiple things at the same time. So I'm going to create a new FSM, and I can either go to add component, Playmaker, add a new FSM, or I can go over here and add FSM to character by clicking on the FSM. And so what it does is it adds 2. So I have 2 of these Playmaker FSMs on the same character at the same time. So they'll both be interactive. So I'll be able to use both codes at the same time, and they won't have to interfere with each other. It doesn't have to go from, let's say, from movement to jump to flipping left and right on the jump. Otherwise I'd have movement, flip left, right, jump, flip left, flip right. I can just do movement, which automatically flips, and then jump, which doesn't need to flip because movement's already telling it to flip. And that kind of makes sense. But let's name these so I know which ones are which. This one I'm going to call, this is state 1, which is referring to state 1. Click on the FSM tag, and this will name the FSM. So FSM, this is called jumping. And we'll switch over to the other FSM. Let's call this one moving. So he's moving, he's jumping. I guess I could have called it walking. So now state 1, we click on that, it'll automatically prompt us to this tab. I'm going to call this state the jump button. So now we have a jump button, and we also want to have a transition, and I haven't made a transition yet, so I'm going to go make an event for the transition. So click the event tab and go to jump pressed, and you can call your transition whatever you want to call it, or your event. So the jump press is going to be my transition. So I'm going to right click, add transition, jump press. So now it appears here. So now I have the option to send this event to somewhere. And on the jump button, before I go sending it to other places, let's go and add a couple actions. So I'm going to add a set animator float right there. So we're going to add, not float, a boolean, set animator boolean. So what this will do, if I click on this, it pops it in here. We're going to use the game object, in this case is the character with all the sprite and collision on him. We're going to set the parameter, and the parameter is referring to this one. These are your parameters. So we're setting the animator, which is this animator tab, the boolean, which we designated ground as a boolean. So we need to tell it which one. It has to be spelled exactly the same way, capital, lowercase, everything, the same letters, in order for it to recognize that it's the same parameter. And we're going to set this one to checkmark, which means true. So check is true, no check is false, and that's your true and false. So check is true, and we want to check this. Actually, we don't need to check this every frame. Once he's on the ground, then we're good. All right, so we've got the ground, and he's on the ground. We also need to do a get key. So get key down. So get key down, we'll add that in here, and I'm going to move this one below it, so not that it matters much. So the key I want to use is eventually the up arrow. So when you press the up arrow, you could code it for whatever other button you want to use. I'm going to reserve the spacebar for the attacking button, so I'm going to use the up arrow for jump, but you can code it to whatever button you want to use. Send event is going to be jump press, and it's here because we've already added it to it, or we've also made it available. So we have the up arrow. When you press pressed, it goes to jump pressed, which sends it to the next state. But whenever it's on this state, it's going to mark him as grounded and true. So I'm going to make a new state now. This one's going to be called jumping. So we've got jump button, and if jump button is pressed, he goes to jumping. So now he's jumping. What do we do on jumping? We're going to need a transition to get back eventually, so we're going to add a finished. So when it's finished, we drag that back to jump button. So you press the jump button, he's in the air, and when he lands on the ground, he goes back and allows you to press the jump button again. Otherwise, if you don't have a something that'll finish it, you could theoretically keep jumping in the air over and over and over again. So we need to code something that will use the finish button. So we'll go back to the action browser, and we need to add a set animator bool. So back to here, set animator boolean. Just like we did before with the last one, we're going to use the same thing. We're going to have this as grounded, and the difference is we're not going to check it because now he's not on the ground. And yeah, so this one, he's on the ground, now he's off the ground, so it's been sent to here, and now it changes this value to false. He's no longer on the ground. So the next thing we want to add is set animator trigger. There it is. All right, so we have the set animator trigger. So we have the boolean and the trigger. The trigger is going to be what we called it, the jump button, as described right here. And you don't really need anything else. It's the game object. It's the user. It's just a trigger setting that this has been triggered. It doesn't need to be true or false. It's just been turned on. All right, and that should work for the trigger part. So let's add in the next thing, which is force. We need to add force 2D. So I'm going to add this here, and I'm going to move this down underneath the trigger. So game object, position, all stuff. All we need to worry about is setting this. So I'm going to click this little dash mark, and that allows me to change from none to a number I can type myself. I'm going to put 320. This is going to be your jump height, so if you put a lower number, he's not going to jump as high. If you put a higher number, he's going to jump really high. So you can vary this number around as much as you want. And we don't want him to jump every frame, we just want him to jump once. Alright, and what happens after we finish this? Also note, if I click the word and I insert an action, it'll insert it above it, but if I click off of it, it'll automatically drop it below it. So if you're clicked up here and you press insert an action, it'll pop it up above this, but this will bring it on the bottom. That makes it a little easier to keep things in order. So we need to add a collision event now. Collision 2D event. So we'll add this on here. So this event will be the collision enter. So on collision enter, collision with what tag? And this is where we defined it as ground. By default, it's not going to list it here until you switch out of that, and now it'll read your tags. But as long as you're here, it's looking for a variable, and we don't have any variables. So we're going to switch this to ground. So now on collision enter with the ground tag. So this has been tagged as a ground, so it knows of all the different objects here, and you can tag multiple different things. Is when it collides the ground event, we're going to send it to finished. So now it won't leave this state until it hits the ground. So it'll always be in the jump state, it'll always be in the air for the one frame that's been accelerated him up, and he'll always be non-grounded, false, and he'll always have the jump button having been pressed. As soon as he hits the ground, which is finished, it sends it over back to jump button, and this is where it sets it he's on the ground true, and it waits for this to occur again. So that should be what we need to have him jumping now. So if I press, let's move this out of the way. Actually, let's move this tab up here, give him some more room. Alright, so if I press play now, he should jump. He can move left and right, and he can jump. Cool, perfect. So he jumps up, he jumps left and right, but you notice he's walking in the air every time you move. If you don't walk, he's just going to stand there. He just pops off the ground. We haven't coded any animation for the character, and it looks like I can't make it up there too high. But he can at least jump. So that's all you would need to make a jump button occur. But we will want to now put a floating state in there, so he has the floating in there at the moment. So we're going to go to, let's slide these out of the way. So I'm going to take these two and slide them over there. And I'm going to put the jumping underneath of any state. So from any state that could occur, so whether he's walking or idle, he doesn't need to transition to this. At any point, he can go to floating in the air. So I'm going to make a transition, and we're going to define at what point the any point occurs. So if I click on this transition, by default, it's set to exit time. So it immediately, or never wanted to, pop into this. So if I press play, he's always there because it never exited him back out. Alright, so we've got the this occurring. We want to say that instead of exit time, we want to say jump button. When the jump button is pushed, go to floating. So you don't need any other parameters or conditions. It's just once that event has occurred, he goes straight to floating. So now if I press play, boom, now he floats. Alright, so now that we have that, we need to exit out of the floating state. So we need two transitions. We're going to right click, make transition to idle, and make transition to walking. This way when he lands, he knows whether we should start walking or standing. So this transition for the idle state should be set as on exit time. So actually we don't really need exit time is fine. So we're going to, no, not exit time, it's grounded. When he's grounded, when the grounding becomes true, he lands on the ground, we want to add the next state to h speed is less than 0.1. Alright, so if grounded is true, so he's on the ground, and his h speed is less than 0.1, which means he's not moving, just go to the idle sprite. We want to use both of these, because if you only have just the one, he could be in the air, in which case he'll start moving or standing still if you're pressing left or right. We want to make sure that he's grounded before he does that. And if you just use grounded and the h speed isn't there, then as soon as he hits the ground, it doesn't know which one to go to because they'll both be grounded. So we want to make this one grounded as well, true, add a parameter, change this one to hSpeed is greater than 0.1. So they're both grounded if he's on the ground, if he's moving or not moving, and we have that. So if I press play now, when I press up, he goes there. As soon as he becomes grounded again, because his collision box collided with the tag of this collision box, so he'll switch out to here. And since he's not moving, he jumps straight to the idle position. Now if I were to start moving when he lands, he'll start automatically walking because he transitions straight into the walking position from landing. And that's pretty much all you would need to make the jump. Now if you wanted to make it a little more realistic, instead of just automatically floating off the ground as soon as he hits jump, we can make him duck down like a realistic person would do to gain the momentum to thrust himself off the ground instead of just floating off the ground. So we're going to do that real quick. Let's pause that, and we're going to use the jumping state. I'm going to slide this down a little bit and insert this up in between here. So we're going to say that when he starts jumping, we're going to make a transition to the jumping state. The jumping state, what triggers this is the jump parameter, the jump button. So if jump button is pressed, it goes to here. So this no longer is controlling the jump button, so I'm going to remove this state. Or just press delete on the keyboard. Boom. So that deletes that. So now, when you press the jump button, he goes to jumping. It'll play his sprite, and we want to go from jumping to floating. So now he's going to be floating in the air. So I guess this could go here. So jump button, plays the jumping, and the transition here is exit time. So as soon as he's done his jump, which is only 4 frames long, he'll go straight into floating. So if I press play now, he bends down. And it looks like it might be occurring a little too fast. So let me go check the animator. Jumping is set to 60. Let me set that to 30. See if that makes a difference. And floating shouldn't matter because it's only 1 frame long, but I can set it to 30. Keep it uniform. So walking is 30, idle is 30, jumping is 30. And let's see if that makes a difference on playback. So yeah, now he's ducking a little bit longer. So the problem now is that he's still popping off the ground immediately, and he's ducking as he's moving into the air. We want him to duck before he leaves the ground. This way it looks a little more realistic. In order to do that, we need to pause him before he lifts off the ground. So we're going to go over to the jumping state, where we have him, as soon as jump is pressed, it sets these variables, and these two will start triggering the sequence. The jump button has been pushed, and he's no longer grounded, so he's going to start running through the sequence. But before he moves, we want this sequence to have started. So I'm going to take these two options and copy these, copy selected, and then delete them off the settings. And I'm going to make a new state, and I'm going to call this new state I guess falling, or else call it floating. So he's floating in the air. I'm going to paste these in here, and then we're going to go from, we need one more thing. Action browser, wait. Oops, too many. Delete. All right, so he's going to wait for 1 second or 1 frame or 1 cycle, I guess. So the finish event will be finished, and finished will go to floating, and floating will go to finished, and this finished will go to jump button, and let's rearrange that. All right, so when the jump button is pressed, we'll go into the air. This will tell it to start playing this animation cycle, and we want to make sure that when the animation cycle is triggered, that we go to, actually, wait probably shouldn't be 1 whole second, it should be like 0.1 second, so a tenth of a second, which is about all we need for him to wait. So it'll wait a tenth of a second, and once it's waited, then it'll lift him off the ground. This way you have a little bit of time for this to play before it moves him to the floating state. So if I press play now, he ducks before he lifts. So he has a tenth of a second to sit on the ground before his character starts moving there. So now it looks like he's ducking and lifting himself off the ground. So it looks a little more realistic. And the next thing, when he lands, he shouldn't just land statically still. He should have a little bit of a weight to him. So he hits the ground, ducks down, and then stands back up, because he's not just going to stop and land flat-footed and not have any problems. So we're going to make a little more realism. We're going to add one more thing. We're going to add create state empty, and I'm going to use this one as landing. So now he's landing, and we're going to use the motion as the same as, and you can make it different motions if you want, but I'm going to reuse the same one, which is the jumping. So you might have your own dynamic way of him landing. His arms come out and he looks all cool and stylish, and he has a different animation. But since I haven't animated a new animation, I'm going to reuse jumping. And the jumping is basically him ducking. So when you go to floating, and now we have here grounded and H speed. So I'm going to use make transition to landing instead of exit time when he's grounded. So he's going to be floating until he becomes grounded, and then he'll be landing. And then these two no longer need the grounded. So I'm just going to delete these two transitions. Oops. Delete, delete. And I'm going to transition between the landing now. All right. And I could probably move these down lower. All right, so we've got him landing. So as soon as he becomes grounded, he's in the landing position, play the jumping animation. And then here we want to make sure he plays the full animation, otherwise he'll just immediately change off. So we want exit time on there. And we want to make sure we do the same thing. H speed is less than 0.1, and this is exit time, so we want to play the full animation before it cuts out. H speed is greater than 0.1. Without the exit time, it'll immediately land, won't even play the sprite, and go straight into the walking or idle, because it's true. So we need to make sure exit time plays it first. Alright, so now, if we press play, he should jump up and land back down. And so wherever he's landing, he's working pretty well. But maybe we can tweak this a bit. His ducking down is too long. Maybe he should duck down a little bit less time. And you can animate it to be a shorter cycle like that. But it looks like he's probably leaning forward for too long for when he lands. So I want that to be a little quicker, just kind of personal, what I think looks better. So I'm going to change jumping to do it twice as fast now. So 1 is 100%, 2 is twice as fast. So I'm reusing the same animation, but now he will land and recover faster. So he has a little bit of a duck, but a much faster duck. So we can jump up, land, and we're pretty much good at this point. So now we have more of a realistic animation if you wanted to go for that. If you didn't want the realism, you could just drop out the jumping and landing and just go straight to floating. So he floats off the air and lands back down, depending on the level of sprite detail you want to have to your game. The only last thing now is that when he walks off a ledge, he's still walking. So wherever he walks, he doesn't transition to a jumping state. We want him to be in the falling state where his legs are just statically still as soon as he leaves the edge, rather than continuously walking. So even if I stop and release, he just goes to idle and fall and drifts straight down. He should be in the falling state when he walks off an edge. So let's go with that last part right there. And if you don't really need the if you just are okay with them walking off an edge and keep walking, then you're fine. But if you wanted to fix that little issue, we're going to go to back to the character. Boom. So we've got the character right here, and we need to add on one more state. So we have the jumping, we have the moving. We're going to add a falling state, which will check while he's falling. So rather than mix it with the other ones, I'm going to call this one falling. So we have falling, jumping, and moving. So the falling state, I'm going to call this one check falling. And this is just the name of the state. So is he falling at the moment? And on this stage, we're going to want to transition, and this is going to be, let's add event floating. I can call it falling if I wanted to, kind of interchange it between the word falling and floating. Floating just kind of meaning that at any point, whether he's moving up or moving down, he's not on the ground. So he's floating, so he's in the air at some point. So we're going to make another state. Actually, let's put the variables in this one first. So action browser, pull this up. So check falling, what's going to occur for this one. We have set animator boolean, and we have actually two of those. So the first one, we're going to have the parameter, we're going to check for grounded and check. So on this state, he's on the ground, and the next one, we're going to set the parameter as floating, and there's no check. So he's not floating and he is grounded. Those are our two true and false statements, and we want to add one more thing. Collision 2D event, and for this collision event we want to say, instead of on enter, on exit. This will trigger going to the floating transition, and we're going to say he's going to exit the ground, so send event to floating, and that's all we need. So instead of pressing key, we're just going to say, because when he walks off we're not pressing a key that signifies he's off the ground, we're just going to say when he leaves that collision he's no longer colliding, he's fallen off. So check exit of that sprite, the ground sprite, and he's now going to go to floating state. So from here, we're going to create a floating state, or check landing, I guess, which I'm going to just use the same thing. Control C, Control V. No. Alright, so check falling 2, I'm going to rename this to check landing. So now he's going to check if he's landing. Floating will go to check landing, and this floating, we're not going to use floating. We can change it out to finished, and then just remove the delete transition. Alright, so finished will go back to check falling. So if he's not on the ground, we're going to go say he's floating, and if he's not floating, then he's back on the ground. Unless you could think of another option between the two, then it gets more complicated. But the difference now is that we had, when he was on the ground, he was grounded, but now he's not on the ground, so he's not grounded. And now he's not on the ground, he's also floating. So it switches between these two. The check marks are changing between the two, and this needs to be set to send event finished. So now on collision exit, in this case we want to say collision enter. So he's entered the ground collision, go to finish. So he's going to be in a falling state the whole time until he does this. And the parameter floating, which we haven't defined yet, will determine what animation to show. So that part's coded in, and let's jump over to add one more parameter. This one's a boolean, which is true or false. This one's going to be floating. So we have the character floating in the air. I'm going to create a new state. Actually, I don't need a new state. I'm going to take jumping and slide it out here, and we're going to bypass jumping and go straight to floating. So make transition to floating. And this one says if floating is true. So we have everything else the same. If the jump button is pushed, he goes to jumping state. As soon as jump has his 4 frames of him docking down, it transitions on exit time to floating, and it repeats. This is saying you never press the jump button, he just automatically became the float state. From any state, he just suddenly became floating, and it just plays through the rest. And the reason he's designated as floating is because, jump over here, floating was false on start, but now we've declared that he's not on the ground, so make floating true. Because floating became true, boom, he moves into the floating state. So if I press play now, the rest of this should look the same. He'll just walk and jump just like normal. It doesn't actually go straight to floating. It goes for the whole jumping parameter when it reads that. But if we walk off now, it goes straight into the falling position. So he falls, and he automatically transitions because he's no longer on the ground. So relatively simple to modify that. There's also, you might notice like a little glitch. Every time you spin around too quickly, you can see him glitching between the falling state and the walking state. So if I turn around quickly, you can see a little bit of a glitch where he's transitioning. And if I get too close to the edge, sometimes it'll start glitching out like that. So we want to try and adjust that if possible, so he's not doing that. What's happening is the physics engine, the 2D physics, as he has enough momentum and he spins, his collider is like 1 pixel popping off the ground. And as soon as he's left the ground, it's reading him as, I'm in a floating state. And then like a millisecond later, he's back on the ground. It's like, oh, I'm not floating anymore. So we want to adjust that little bit of a glitch to kind of work out him switching like that. We want him to switch cleanly. This can be a little tricky, but we'll try and get this to work. So we're going to go back to here, and instead of having it go straight to him floating, we're going to move this one down here and make a new state. And this state's going to be check fall speed. Floating will go to check fall speed, and we're going to add a transition. I could use finished if I wanted to, but I can also use floating, I guess. So either way, it's just going to use the same name tag, but it's not going to go right through the two states. So floating will go here. And let's move that over there to make it a little neater. When you rearrange things, it kind of moves your arrows around. All right, so we've got the check falling, and if falling is suddenly true, then we're going to check fall speed. And fall speed is going to be how fast is he falling. If he's only popping off the ground for 1 pixel, he's obviously not going to be falling very fast. And if he's not falling fast, then don't change him to falling speed. If he's falling off an edge, he's going to be picking up acceleration. So now we know that he's moving at faster speed. He must really be falling and not glitching on the ground. So we're going to go over to get velocity 2D. So pop this in here, and we only need to get the y velocity, and we want to store the y velocity as a variable. So let's go make a variable, and I'm going to call this new variable y velocity. Jump back to the state and say that get the velocity, which is the up and down y vertical of the character, and set it to y velocity so I can use this later. So now we're going to go and check I'm going to add a float absolute. I'm going to drop this underneath. All right, so we're going to take that variable, the y velocity, and I'm going to make it absolute. Let's do this every frame for everything. So for every frame that this is on, keep checking the y velocity and make it a positive number, because if he's falling, it's going to be a negative number, and we can't use a negative number for what we're doing. So we're going to make it a positive number. So if it's any more than 0.4, plus or minus, within positive or negative, it'll read this. So let's click off that, and let's add one last event or action. So float compare. So we've named the velocity y velocity. We've made it a positive number, and now we're going to compare. Switch out this and say we're going to compare this y velocity, which we don't know what it is. It changes all the time. We're going to compare it to, and we can pick a number here. This part gets a little. You might have to play around with the settings. So let's try 0.4. So if y velocity and 0.4, so if y velocity is less than 0.4, we're going to go to finished, and we need a finished state on here. All right, move that over there. So if he has less than 0.4 velocity in the y direction, which means he's not moving fast up or down, then go back to finished state. He's not actually falling. And then over here it says if it's greater than 0.4, he's falling at a faster speed now. He's probably really actually falling and not glitching on the ground. So we're going to set this to floating, so now he really is floating, and then it checks again for collision enter, reset, so it repeats the cycle. So it double checks it basically, and if the double check says, yeah, he is really falling, then play this. And let's see what happens now. Alright, so now when I'm spinning back and forth, he goes between the two walks and he's not glitching no matter how I walk. If I get close to the edge, he's not glitching between the falling states. He's just transitioning nice and clean between the two walks. He can still jump and land just fine. He can land and go into walking. And if he falls off the edge, it looks like he's still walking, so our value is a little bit too high. He should be falling because of the speed. So we need to adjust that 0.4 value. In this case, it looked like it just worked then. So let's pause that and let's try changing the speed to, let's say, 0.3. So it's a slower speed. So if he walks off now, looks like it's still, nope, that time it, so it's a little, sometimes it's different. Yeah, now it looks like it's transitioning nice and clean between the fall states. And let's check, we're flipping him around and he's not transitioning to the jump state or the falling state while walking. So even if he's on the edge, moving around, he's not glitching on the edge. And if he falls off, looks like that time he didn't. So in that time he did. So sometimes you might have to adjust that number to figure out what the right number is that works for him. And the last thing, let's try and put him up there and see what happens. Pause that. Close out that. This is too tall, so I'll move it down over here somewhere where you can actually land on it. And one more thing to note, there is no edge collider on here. So because there's no collider, he's going to walk right through it. So I need to add a collider, 2D physics edge collider, and then kind of draw out where I want that edge collider to go. So I'm going to hold shift and move that up there, move that down there, put that up there, and kind of just draw a collision for where I think this should go. And the same thing with the last one. So I click on this one, add component, 2D, edge collider. Oops. Alright, so now these have collision. Press play. And he should be able to jump up to here and start building a level. So he walks off, he goes to the falling state. And it looks like everything's working. And this one we never tagged as ground. So you can see what happens. Because it doesn't know that it's a ground sprite, it doesn't know to change it because there is no tag. So he still thinks he's floating because the code never read it as ground. And he won't even jump because it doesn't know that he's on the ground. So I need to change this one as well, this last one, to a tagged ground state. So now he'll be able to jump off the last one. So he walks over, falls, and falls, and falls, and now he can jump. And that should about work with the coding. So it looks like everything's working. Sometimes it does take a little bit of effort to get that glitch worked out where he's just hovering slightly above the ground. But in this case, it, thank God, seems to work. Awesome, cool. So, yep, that's it. And next part we'll cover a bit more interactions and enemy stuff. But right now, just go through and start building a level and have him navigate all the way around. You should be able to do whatever he wants now.